Good day, everyone, and welcome to the National Asthma Awareness Month webcast. During today's event, you ask questions over the phone lines. Please dial 800-225-9448 and provide conference ID asthma. Please note, you can mute the media player or click the phone icon below it to prevent an echo. Once on the line, you may register to ask a question by pressing the star and 1 keys. If you require technical assistance during today's event, you can reference the help link at the top of your screen. Please note today's call will be recorded, and I will be standing by should you need any assistance. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Executive Director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association, Albert Gore. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Albert Gore. I'm the Executive Director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association, and I'm excited to serve as your moderator for today's conversation. ZETA is the first industry-backed coalition of its kind advocating for the full adoption of electric vehicles. Our membership is composed of companies throughout the EV supply chain, from critical mineral producers to vehicle and charger manufacturers, battery recyclers, and electricity providers, all united around the goal of 100% zero-emission vehicle sales. And we're part of a broader coalition of groups advocating for this transition because of the multitude of overlapping benefits that it brings, including reducing carbon pollution, economic development, and job growth in the United States, and importantly, for the dramatic improvements to public health that result from reducing tailpipe emissions from the nearly 300 million cars and trucks driving across the country and through our neighborhoods every day. The conversation about transportation emissions as a matter of policy often focuses on greenhouse gases in the context of mid-century emissions reductions goals, and many states have adopted policies oriented around ending the sale of gas cars by 2035 with that in mind. ZETA's founding goal was to reach 100% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2030, both because we as a group believe this is achievable, possible based on current technology and what we see in terms of consumer demand, but also because it really matters how quickly we do this. GHG emissions in the atmosphere have a compounding effect, and a ton of CO2 reduced or avoided in 2023 is much more important than one avoided in 2050. And this is even more true for the public health impacts of things like particulate matter from tailpipe emissions in our communities today. And it's important to clearly communicate that as a critical reason to move quickly, which brings us to our conversation today. As we recognize Asthma Awareness Month, we acknowledge the significant role of burning fossil fuels on air pollution, directly causing asthma attacks and other health complications. And by adopting EVs and removing fossil fuel pollution from our roads, we can significantly improve the health of our families and communities. And it's critically important to emphasize that the benefits of zero-emission transportation extend to every community these vehicles drive through every day. So we have an amazing panel of experts with us today. We're excited to welcome Dr. Shelley Francis of EVHybridNoire, Andrea Marpillero-Colomina of GreenLatinos, Almeda Cooper of Moms Clean Air Force, and Alejandra Nunez of Environmental Protection Agency. During the next 50 minutes or so, I'll turn it over to our expert guests to discuss air pollution, its sources, what impact it has on public health, how it disproportionately impacts low-income communities, communities of color, and how this impacts environmental and social equity, how parents transitioning over to electric school buses specifically can protect children's health and create better health outcomes for communities across the United States, and finally, how recently introduced vehicle emission standards can help improve the situation, as well as federal legislation over the last several years, and the impacts that will have. So after each of our guests has discussed their topics, we'll then follow up with some questions for the panelists. And if everything goes to schedule, we expect to have some time at the end for questions from members of the media. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Shelley Francis, co-founder and managing partner of EVHybridNoire, to discuss the sources of air pollution and its impacts on public health.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Shelley Francis, co-founder and director at EVHybridNoire. EVHybridNoire is a national 501c3 nonprofit that's the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts with thousands of members across the United States, as well as outside of the U.S. We're also the co-founders of a global electric vehicle association that represents close to 70 countries with several 100,000 members working to advance EV adoption. EVHybridNoire's mission is to equitably increase awareness of multimodal clean transportation and accelerate its adoption in a manner that is inclusive to all communities. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the impact of air pollution, where it comes from, and its impact on public health. So air pollution comes from a variety of sources, both natural and human-made. Natural sources include wildfires, volcanoes, dust storms. Human-made sources can include transportation, industrial activity, power generation, residential and commercial heating and cooking. Now, air pollution is a serious threat to public health, and it's linked to a wider range of health problems, including asthma, attacks, heart disease, lung cancer, and premature deaths. So first, I'd just like to just touch on those related health issues. So first, respiratory problems. When you have exposure to air pollution, it can cause a variety of problems such as coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath. It can also exacerbate existing conditions such as asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, also known as COPD. Cardiovascular issues are also a challenge. Air pollution has been linked to increased risk of heart disease, stroke, and other cardiovascular problems. This is thought to be due to the impact of air pollution on inflammation, oxidative stress, and other factors that can contribute to these conditions. It also contributes to neurological problems. So air pollution has been linked to a range of neurological problems, including cognitive decline, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. Finally, cancer is also another challenge. So some types of air pollution, such as particulate matter, have been linked to an increased risk of cancer, particularly lung cancer. So now let's talk for a minute about the impact of air pollution on public health, in addition to the other factors that we just shared. So according to a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2021, an estimated 16% of deaths each year in the United States can be attributed to exposure to air pollution. The study analyzed data for more than 30 years, from 1990 to 2019, and found that exposure to fine particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and ozone, among other pollutants, contributed to 4.1 million premature deaths globally in 2019, with 350,000 of those deaths occurring in the United States. Now, looking at specific populations, when we talk about this issue, we usually focus on vulnerable populations, which are the children and the elderly. So vulnerable populations such as children and the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions, are particularly susceptible to the impacts of air pollution. They may experience more severe symptoms and may be at greater risk of developing health problems as a result of this exposure. Now, children are particularly susceptible to the effects of air pollution because their respiratory systems are still developing, and they tend to breathe more air per pound of body weight than adults. Now, exposure to air pollution during childhood can lead to a range of health problems, including asthma, reduced lung function, and respiratory infections. And in addition, exposure to air pollution during pregnancy can increase the risk of low birth weight, preterm birth, and developmental delays. Then finally, in the elderly, they're at increased risk from the effects of air pollution because they may have pre-existing health conditions such as heart disease or respiratory problems that can be exacerbated by exposure to air pollution. The elderly may also have reduced lung function and a weakened immune system, which can make them more susceptible to respiratory infections and other health problems. So as you can see, there's a number of impacts that exposure to air pollution has on the well-being of diverse communities. So next, I will transition and let my next colleague speak about the next issue as it relates to asthma prevention.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. I would now like to turn it over to Andrea Marpillero-Colomina, Sustainable Communities Program Director at GreenLatinos, to discuss how air pollution disproportionately burdens low-income communities and communities of color and all the consequences of that for environmental and social equity.
Thank you so much.
Andrea?
Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Andrea Marpillero-Colomina, and I am the Sustainable Communities Program Director at GreenLatinos. GreenLatinos is a comunidad of Latino environmental and conservation champions. We fight against climate change and environmental degradation that intensifies systemic social, health, and economic injustices in our communities. Every morning in neighborhoods across the United States, 45 million people wake up within 300 feet of a major roadway or transportation facility. We know that pollutants from cars and trucks fill our lungs and contaminate the air around us. Unfortunately, almost none of us here will be surprised to learn that this pollution burden isn't equally shared. The 2023 American Lung Association State of the Air report that was released a few weeks ago found that people of color are 3.7 times more likely than white people to live in a county with failing national air quality standards, putting these communities at greater risk of severe health impacts and premature death. These disparities have only increased over time relative to the air quality standards set by the U.S. EPA. Nationwide, Latinos and other people of color experience disproportionate exposure to fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, as Dr. Shelley discussed, leading to higher rates of asthma, as well as lung disease, heart disease, and other pollution-triggered conditions. Furthermore, when we sort of look into the ALA State of the Air report, we find that about 119, let's round it up because it's 119.6, so let's just call it a cool 120 million people live in places with failing grades for unhealthy levels of ozone and particulate pollution. And these folks are living in areas that perhaps over the course of the day have daily spikes of deadly particle pollution that are much higher than the current standard for healthy air. We find that although, from the State of the Air report, we found that, again, although people of color are 41% of the overall population, they are making up the majority of folks living in counties with failing air grades. And we found that the failing grades for some counties there are three kinds of failing air grades, and in some counties, all three of those grades are failing grades, and 18 million people are affected by living in those neighborhoods. This is pretty shocking, and I think we should just sort of think about this in terms of the consequences that it bears on the people that live in these neighborhoods. So, for example, in California, Latino residents experience 40% higher levels of particulate matter exposure, whereas in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, that rate is even higher. It reaches up to 75% higher. So we're seeing that across the country, whether the rate is 40% higher or 75% higher or somewhere in the middle, or perhaps in some places slightly lower, we're seeing that Latino communities are disproportionately pollution burdened, and they're more likely to live, as are other people of color and lower income folks, likely to live in what are called diesel death zones, which are areas where truck emissions create even greater risk of lung disease, asthma, and cancer. Latino children are 3 times more likely than white children to live in counties with low air quality, and about 10% of Latino children suffer from asthma, and Latino children are shockingly 40% more likely to die from asthma than non-Latino white children. So we're looking at a serious consequence for the health of all people, but particularly children who are vulnerable for the reasons that Dr. Shelley and Mr. Gore discussed. We really are calling on, the urgency of moving us towards zero emission vehicles. And the number one way we can do that is by creating legislation and creating policy from US EPA, on the legislative side from Congress, and at the state level that will pressure automakers to produce lower emission and zero emission vehicles. And this is something that is incredibly important for ensuring environmental justice for all, and foreseeing that, in our lifetime, we can reduce or eliminate the number of people waking up every day in neighborhoods that are polluting their lungs. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot of numbers that I just threw at everybody, and pass it back to Mr. Gore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Next, we have Almeda Cooper, who is the Manager of Health Equity at Moms Clean Air Force, to discuss how electric school buses can protect our children from air pollution and asthma attacks, and also contribute to much greater and better health outcomes for our communities. Almeda, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Moms Clean Air Force is a grassroots organization of 1.5 million moms, dads, and caregivers, and we're united in our fight against we're united in our fight for clean air and for children's health. And when you think about children, and school-age children in particular, what iconic symbol of school children is the school bus. There are about 26 million children and also their bus drivers who are riding to school, going to after-school activities each and every day of the school year. And unfortunately, on dirty diesel polluting buses, they're being subjected to tailpipe pollution, which is a known carcinogen. And certainly as a mom, you do not want to send your child on a bus, which should be the sort of one of the happiest moments or memories that most of us have about our school years. And in fact, when I think about, I have an adult daughter, but I remember the first time that she got on a bus and how excited she was and how excited I was. And it was, a very memorable moment. But I had no idea then, as we do now, that I was exposing my daughter and her little friends to tailpipe pollution from a dirty diesel bus. Asthma, as has already been mentioned, is the largest chronic disease of children in this country. Parents who have children who have asthma on days when the air is really bad cannot put their child on a school bus to go to school because of the aggravation of the pollution that they're being exposed to. And that's certainly a burden for many parents who don't have many other options other than to use a public school bus to get their children to school. It's already been mentioned that people of color, Black and brown, and low wealth communities are often located near chemical plants, near highways. So the combination of the pollution from the buses and these other sources of pollution are very dramatic and also are affecting our children. We, at Moms Clean Air Force, we have been supporting electric school buses. And one of the things I want to say is that one of the really good developments is that as a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, $5 billion was allocated over a 5-year period to grant rebates to school districts across the country. And that program, which has been administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, by the EPA, has been very successful. In fact, in the first round, where it was expected that there would be $500 million worth of grants made, there was such a tremendous response that they were able to award $1 billion. And there will be other rounds of rebates over the next 5 years. Right now, we're actually in a where the EPA is administering or has just opened a period relating to grants. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But the main thing that I want to say is that at Moms Clean Air Force, we really encourage our members to communicate with their elected officials, communicate with school districts to make sure that they can take advantage of opportunities like the EPA administered program to help school districts obtain electric school buses, and to speak up and let their elected officials know how important this is. And we try to empower them and give them the tools to be able to be successful in that communication. Turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Almida. Thank you all for just an amazing description of this problem, which is terrifying and also heartbreaking. But we're so lucky to have Alejandra Nunez, the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mobile Sources in the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, with us today to talk about recent proposed vehicle emission rules and the impact that will have. And we understand how important it is, and really, really grateful to have you here to explain how your office is addressing all of these issues. So, Ms. Nunez, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Albert. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here to talk about EPA's efforts to reduce pollution from cars and trucks and protect public health. The Clean School Bus program that Almida mentioned is one important piece, but right now I'm going to focus on the regulatory work. So in the last couple of years, we've made great progress on new standards that will begin to accelerate the ongoing transition to a clean vehicles future. Very recently, in December of last year, we issued the strongest ever national clean standards to cut smog and soot forming emissions from heavy-duty trucks, which begins in model year 2027. That regulation hadn't been updated in more than 20 years. So that's an important effort that will reduce pollution and improve public health in significant ways. But also on April 11, we issued two proposals that are very important. Both of them are focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For heavy-duty standards, they are exclusively greenhouse gas reductions. Starting in model year 2027, those standards would complement the nitrogen oxide standards that we finalized in December. But also on the same day, we proposed multi-pollutant emission standards for passenger cars and light-duty trucks. That proposal would also begin in model year 2027. And those standards build on EPA's existing emission standards for light-duty vehicles for model years 2023 through 2026 that we finalized in December of 2021. These standards for new vehicles are very, very important to improve air quality for communities across the nation, particularly those communities that have borne the greatest brunt of poor air quality and health impacts. How would they deliver health benefits? Well, the pollution reductions mean reductions in fine particulate matter that cause premature death, heart attacks, respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses, aggravated asthma, and decreased lung function, as we have been discussing. Together, the light-duty and heavy-duty proposals that where we're currently taking comment, they would avoid more than 9 billion tons of CO2 emissions, which is equivalent to nearly twice the total U.S. CO2 emissions in 2022. So let me talk a little bit about the approach we use when developing these two proposals for cars and light-duty trucks and then for heavy-duty trucks. So we consider the suite of control technologies that are already available, and we all know the transition to zero-emission technologies is already happening. So the standards use the same framework that EPA has been using for several decades now. They are performance-based standards, and they are designed to allow manufacturers to meet those standards however works best for the vehicle fleets. But we are actually looking at how the transition to the zero-emission vehicle future is already happening, and we are projecting penetrations for those developments. So for light-duty vehicle standards, depending on the compliance pathway that manufacturers select, but we are projecting that electric vehicles could account for 67% of new light-duty vehicle sales. And then medium-duty, which I should have mentioned, we are also including medium-duty trucks in the light-duty vehicle proposal. We are projecting that 46% of new medium-duty vehicle sales will be electric by model year 2032. And then, as I mentioned, that proposal is multi-pollutant. So we are proposing particulate matter standards that are expected to drive widespread use of filters to reduce gasoline particulate matter emissions, which would decrease pollution very, very, very significantly. For heavy-duty standards, we are proposing, depending on the pathway that manufacturers select, and that standard will include school buses that Almira was talking about. We are reflecting a level of penetration of 50% for vocational vehicles, 35% for short-haul tractors, and 25% for long-haul tractors in 2032. These standards are achievable. Our analysis shows that the market can support these types of efficiency gains and technology improvements. The market is already moving very quickly in that direction. We inform the proposals with what we're seeing in the market and the investments that industry is making in zero-emission technologies and the major investments that Congress enabled for clean vehicle technologies and infrastructure through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. As the greenhouse gas standards have increased in stringency, manufacturers have begun to rely on a range of electrification technologies. They include not only electric, but also hybrid electric, plug-in hybrid, and battery electric, as I mentioned before. Battery costs have continued to decline. Consumer interest in electric vehicles is growing. So we're looking at all of that as part of our analysis and have concluded in our proposal that the proposed standards are feasible and cost-effective, probably more now than ever before. The proposed standards are also critical in maintaining the U.S. position as a global leader in clean vehicle technologies. But more importantly, what I want to focus on for purposes of this discussion is the extraordinary benefits of the rules we're proposing. So the monetary net benefits of the light and medium duty proposal are in the range of $850 billion to $1.6 trillion, while the monetary net benefits of the heavy duty rule are in the range of $180 billion to $320 billion. The benefits, as we all know, would include the reduced impacts of climate change, improved public health from lower pollution, and also very significant cost savings for vehicle owners by reducing their cost for fuel and also reducing the cost of maintenance and repair costs of electric vehicles. We're taking comment on both proposals. We held a public hearing on the heavy-duty proposal last week, and we're holding a public hearing on the light-duty proposal this week. The comment period is open, and we look forward to engaging with all stakeholders as we work to finalize these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ale. I think the proposed rule is so important and is often covered in terms of the expected impact on sales of electric vehicles by a certain date. But I think it's so important to hear you speak about it in the context of protecting public health, which of course is the basis for the rule. And so really appreciate you being with us and walking us through that. More to that point, I wanted to ask a follow-up question to Dr. Francis about asthma, pediatric asthma, which NIH describes as a global epidemic. It affects millions of children in the United States, and it's one thing to view it as an aggregate number, which is overwhelming. But I think what I'd like to ask you is, at the community level, we heard a little bit from Almira about what it means to a parent to have a child with asthma and to have concerns about and to potentially affect your decision whether to put your child on the school bus that day. What are the other impacts to families, to communities of asthma, and particularly childhood asthma, in terms of lost school days and emergency room visits? And if you could help us understand it at that level.
Oh, sure. So, as we said earlier, Asthma is a chronic respiratory disease that is affecting millions of people worldwide. Prevalence has been increasing over the last several decades. They can be severe and life-threatening and obviously have a significant impact on a person's quality of life. So one of the largest societal impacts that we've seen is just the economic burden it places on individuals, families, and communities as a whole. So the cost of treating asthma, for instance, including medications, hospitalizations, and lost productivity, are really significant. In the United States alone, asthma-related healthcare costs are estimated to be over $80 billion annually, and that's billions with a B. In addition to the economic costs, asthma has a significant impact on the overall health of cities, states, and communities. So high levels of air pollution, which can trigger asthma attacks, are often concentrated in urban core and urban areas, leading to higher rates of asthma in cities, as my other colleagues have shared. So this can help really exacerbate health inequities and lower income. Also, minority communities are often disproportionately impacted by air pollution and asthma. It also has significant broader impacts on the healthcare system, such as increased emergency room visits. We see that with Black and brown children. They're presenting at the hospital at much higher rates than, non-Black and brown children. And so this can cause a strain, obviously, on the healthcare resources, lead to increased healthcare costs, not alone to, lower quality of health for children. So overall, the prevalence of asthma and asthma attacks highlight the need for increased public awareness of the condition, as well as what the triggers are that can really accelerate or exacerbate the asthma, crises, as well as we need to improve efforts around air quality, transitioning to clean multimodal transportation, reducing exposure to allergens and irritants within the household as well, and ensuring access to accessible and affordable, effective treatments.
Great. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask a follow-up to Andrea. Can you describe some of the ways that low-income communities and communities of color are fighting air pollution and communicating about its impacts, advocating for policy change? Are there strategies or tactics that you've observed that have been especially impactful? And is there a call to action for folks who want to support these efforts?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Communities all over the country are fighting hard to raise public awareness and lobby their elected officials at all levels of government, city, state, federal, to do something about the impacts of vehicle pollution in their neighborhood. Just to give you one example, in my own backyard, I live in New York City. The port of New York and New Jersey is one of the nation's biggest and busiest ports. It now is mostly on the New Jersey side. And in Newark, New Jersey, there's a really wonderful community-based organization called the Ironbound Community Corporation, and they started their work really because they were seeing that in their neighborhood, children were experiencing asthma attacks at much higher rates than in other areas of the city, and unfortunately, in this majority Latino low-income neighborhood, the hospital resources were far away, right? So children were often in really, really dire shape when they finally got to an emergency room. And it was clear that the majority of the pollution that was triggering these asthma attacks was coming from trucks that were driving through their neighborhood, not servicing necessarily even businesses in their neighborhood, but just either using it as a cut through or, the areas of the neighborhood that were close enough to a highway. And that is one example of a neighborhood that has done a lot, or a community organization in a locality that's done a lot of work to really show, the connection between freight traffic going to and from the port of New York and New Jersey, which creates one of these diesel death zones in Newark, and has pressured successfully the government of New Jersey, the state government of New Jersey and the local government in Newark to provide better services, asthma and healthcare services for children in that neighborhood. And then you see parallels of that in neighborhoods all over the country. On the opposite coast at the Port of Long Beach, we see very similar activism, where again, those communities which are disproportionately low income, disproportionately communities of color, are fighting back and showing really the impact of truck pollution and vehicle pollution in their communities every day. And I would say the call to action, I think, Ali from US EPA really sort of opened that door, right? One of the most important and effective ways that we can really raise our voices and show our concern is by showing up at these public hearings and providing comment and testimony when those rulemakings are being made. And so we make it really clear what our concerns are. We make it really clear what our expectations are, and we hold government agencies at all levels accountable to that.
Thank you so much. I want to move to Almeida here for a follow-up. What can we expect in the near and long term, but particularly in the near term when it comes to the transition to electric school buses? And are there any particular states or communities, cities that are moving particularly quickly and that we might look to as a model as other cities consider this?
Well, what I mentioned, just alluded to just a few moments ago, is that probably the next thing that we're going to see is that the EPA has opened up a period for school districts to submit applications for grants. And in fact, they're going to have a webinar on May the 10th, and you can go to the EPA website to get the specifics so they can tell school districts about what the qualifications will be for that grant application process. Even though we're just extraordinarily excited about the bipartisan infrastructure law funds that were awarded, of course, that's just the beginning in terms of how many school buses are needed across the country. But the positive aspect of the fact that in this first round of awards that were made, that I believe there were rebates awarded in every state. So part of school buses, electric school buses, is people getting a chance to see them, ride them, and experience them, and also to find out some of the perhaps myths that they have are just, not true. When we have talked to school bus drivers, for example, they really like electric school buses once they get a chance to drive them because they're quiet, because they can actually hear the children on the school bus and, make sure that they're okay on the bus. I mean, those are just, very kind of practical things. In terms of states that have really been leaders, California and New York are two states that people often look to see because of their progress with transitioning to clean energy school buses. I'm in Washington, D.C., and in one of our neighboring communities in Maryland, they have gone completely, a whole school district transition to electric school buses. So that's always an exciting opportunity to learn about that. What again, as has been mentioned by my colleagues, is really important is that when there are these EPA hearings that relate to regulation of heavy-duty vehicles, including school buses, that we show up and that we have volunteers and members who talk. In the last round of heavy-duty hearings that Ms. Nunez referred to, Moms Clean Air Force was able to have more than 60 people comment and testify and talk about. We're not the scientific experts, but to talk about the real lived experiences of how these strengthening of these rules impacts people's lives, and also how important it is that there are clean energy school buses because of the many positive aspects of transitioning to clean energy.
Thank you so much. It is one of the things that makes me hopeful is that even independent of the public health and climate benefits of electric vehicles, in general, the people, once they have a chance to drive them, whether it's a car or a school bus, they prefer it. And so that gives me hope that this transition is going to accelerate. Thank you so much. Lastly, I want to ask a follow-up to Alejandra, Ms. Nunez, sorry. Can you give us just some additional context on how the new proposed rulemaking for automakers is going to interact with the current investments that have been made in reducing air pollution and improving health outcomes?
Yes, I'll be happy to. So the proposed vehicle rulemakings are basically very much in harmony with the ecosystem that Congress and many states are creating for the shift to clean transportation options. Both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act are supporting clean vehicles, infrastructure development, research and development, manufacturing, and consumer incentives for the purchase of clean vehicles. And then the IRA also provides incentives for both the production of clean renewable electricity and for clean hydrogen. And as I mentioned before, in addition to all of that, several manufacturers have publicly stated plans for transition in their fleets, both on light duty and heavy duty, to all electric by certain timeframes. For light duty, many of them by 2035, almost entirely. So in setting our proposed standards, we consider these developments, the significant investments in electric vehicles that industry is making, the historic financial incentives of the bill and IRA. I will say we have proposals and we have a range of alternatives under each. And we're also seeking comment not only on the proposed targets for the years 2027 through 2032 under both proposals, but also whether either or both of the standards should increase in stringency beyond model year 2032, for example, through 2035, and then what is the trajectory that EPA should look at to set those stringencies. So we really look forward to the public comments on this and all other topics in the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are right on schedule, so thank you all for keeping us on time. We have some time for questions from the audience, if anybody would like to ask the panelists follow-ups or comments.
Certainly. So questions will be taken over the phone today. Please dial 800-225-9448 and provide conference ID ASTMA. Please note you can mute the media player or click the phone icon below to prevent an echo. Once on the line, you may register to ask a question by pressing the star key and the 1. If your question has been answered, you may remove yourself from the question queue by pressing star 2. We will pause to allow any questions to queue. And again, that's 800-225-9448 to ask a question. We'll pause a moment to allow any further questions to queue.
While we wait, oh, do we have one?
No, sir, no questions.
Okay. While we wait, I think I have a quick question, and maybe Dr. Shelley, maybe you could talk a little bit about the CFI program that has recently been put into action. I know that we're planning some opportunities to speak about that in the future, but what do you see as even just taking a step back and looking at the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA and their impact on rapidly accelerating electrification, but also expanding access to vehicles and charging in these communities, which of course will translate to lower emissions as more and more vehicles owned and parked in these communities are zero emission. What do you think is the most impactful near-term policy in those laws?
That's a really great question, Al. So one of the things I think that's really impactful in terms of the policy is making it more accessible in terms of the price point. So with the incentives and rebates, that and moving them to be able to be applied at the point of sale is going to have a significant impact, particularly on, low to mediate income communities. And so one of the things that you'll see in much more progressive countries that have a much higher adoption rate around clean transportation and EVs, particularly, incentives and rebates have really helped accelerate that transition, as has education and awareness and infrastructure. And so not too long ago, we had the pleasure of working with GreenLatinos, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Consumer Reports, and looking at just what are the barriers and facilitating factors to EV adoption, both in general market and in minority, BIPOC, Black and Brown communities. And so some of the, challenges that we've seen aren't things that we're unfamiliar with. It is, range anxiety, access to charging, cost of vehicles. And so some of the things that we need to do, in addition to the infrastructure bills and the resources at point of service, we need to do a better job of doing education and outreach and normalizing EV adoption for communities. And that's one of the things that EVHybridNoire is definitely, that's within our mission and values, is to make sure that we're showing communities that there are multimodal clean transportation options that will be available and that can be prioritized based on their community's mobility needs. But I think for me, those are some of the things that I'm excited about, being able to make this technology much more accessible, but also tailor it to the specific needs of communities particularly, because every community doesn't need to have everybody does need to have a single occupancy vehicle. So they don't need to have a personal EV. Would like to accelerate the number, but some communities may need more clean buses, more bikes and scooters. So it really will depend. And I think it's really important that those strategies be tailored so that they can really meet the specific needs of said communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelley. So, Andrea, I wanted to ask you about the importance of medium and heavy duty vehicles relative to light duty. Light duty gets a lot of the attention in coverage of policy, but there has been, I think, a lot of recent focus on medium and heavy duty. Obviously, the vehicle availability in that sector has lagged behind light duty for a few years, but now we're starting to see last mile delivery vehicles, logistics vehicles. How important is that relative to light duty electrification for the communities you're connected with? I know you gave a very poignant example earlier, but I think so many folks are looking at the implications for light duty policy, but how do we make sure that we focus on medium and heavy duty right now?
Sure. Well, just for starters, we know that transportation is the biggest cause of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And those transportation emissions disproportionately come from heavy duty vehicles. So the problem here, right, in terms of the air that people are breathing and the impact on people living in neighborhoods adjacent to major roadways is heavy duty vehicles. We have to do a lot of work, right? Like our lifestyle, increasingly, I think the pandemic was terrible in many ways. But one of the things that was sort of one of the unspoken terrible things of the pandemic was that everybody started getting everything delivered to their house for safety at first, but then it got real comfortable. And there are trucks, crisscrossing roadways and not even highways, just like avenues in places all over the country, emitting toxic diesel fumes. And that's somewhere where we've really got to, number one, spend some time strategically thinking about how these trucks are allowed and enabled to operate. And again, in New York, just drawing from where I'm from, I live on a street where trucks are not supposed to drive down unless they're making deliveries on that street. And I happen to live within 300 feet of a highway. And there are many trucks that exit the highway and just choose to drive down the street. And they're not, and they're emitting pollutants into the neighborhood, and they're not really ever stopped, or I've never seen a truck get ticketed. And I think in terms of, sort of on a more technological note, we've got to really incentivize through pressure, whatever that pressure may be, sort of political pressure, economic pressure, straight up shame. Both the truck manufacturers and the companies that have large fleets of trucks, whether that be like UPS, FedEx, or a major beer distributor, and really urge them to really see the impact that the trucks have in the communities where they are driving through, and think about solutions to alternatives to trucks, right? Like I've seen, for example, a little bit of utopia where sometimes there's some Amazon delivery folks who are on cargo bikes, right? And that would be that's like in neighborhoods where that's feasible, that's a much more preferable option than like a truck driving around a block, in a circle, or a 3-block radius in a circle, delivering goods. So those are just, a few thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. I know a lot of people remember, especially early in the pandemic, the sky was really clear and you could see stars at night. And it was, that was a very powerful example of how, in the aggregate, these emissions had been reduced, but a great example of an effect that we often see here, which is that even if aggregate emissions have been reduced, sometimes in those localized examples, they increase for one reason or another. And unfortunately, I think that last mile delivery example has remained. It is convenient, but it needs to be zero emission, ideally. Almida, just a quick follow-up. What are some things that parents can do now to protect their children from exposure and risk for childhood asthma as we are, undergoing the transition?
Some of the things are just very practical. One of the things is that school, any of us who've had children who you had to pick up from school, who've ever sat in a long line while the bus is idle and the little children are out playing on the schoolyard, and your car may also be contributing to that, we suggest that you try to carpool or do things that will just reduce the time and the number of cars that are idling in front of a school, because that's impacting, all of the children that are standing there. That's not always a simple solution. The other thing is just taking action and being involved. As I mentioned earlier, one of our most important activities at Moms Clean Air Force is that we try to empower parents to communicate with their school districts and their local officials, as well as with the EPA or with their congresspeople or with their senators, because at the local level, what we've found is very often the school district the members of the school board may not even be aware of the severity of the issue, or may not have the facts about the health impacts of tailpipe pollution or how children are being affected. As another very practical action that parents can take is to work with their schools in terms of having an action plan if the school has a school nurse, or with the school district, so that when their child is impacted, that there's a plan already in place to help reduce the impacts of asthma as it affects the child in the school setting. There's no one pathway, but the most important, again, I keep saying it over and over again, but the most important thing is just speaking up, being informed, and being aware. The George Mason University Center for Climate Communication has pointed out that one of the biggest problems is no longer that we have as many people who don't acknowledge and accept that there's climate change and that there are impacts, but the fact that people are not talking about it and thinking about what they can do.
Thank you so much. And we have just a few minutes, but Ale, I wanted to ask you a follow-up about the proposed rules, which, are in the comment period. For those of us who believe in the importance of the rule, understand the basis for it, and want to defend it, what can people do? And what do you see as the risk that either the rules won't have the intended effect or that they can change in ways that may weaken their effect?
So, well, thank you. Yes, I think the best way to make sure that EPA, and we mentioned this before, right? The comment period is open, and participating in the rulemaking process, particularly within the deadline, basically requires us to consider all the comments received. And we will continue doing the analysis of the Clean Air Act factors of the feasibility of the technology, the cost, and looking at other things like safety, consumer preferences. So some of them are statutorily required, and then we look at other factors. We will continue to do our job, but really what will allow us to land the most protective standards that are feasible and comply with the legal requirements is going to be the robustness of the record that all members of the public who are interested in these rules can provide and help us from that perspective. I think that is really the best way to get involved, and we are very much focused on reducing emissions to protect the American public, and this is very important for us. So we really look forward to interested members of the public participating in that process, because it's that record that will form the basis of what the EPA is going to finalize.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for your participation today. I think given everything that we heard from our panelists, it's a great call to action to folks to go participate in that stakeholder process and the comment process and make your voice heard as the EPA is doing its job and protecting public health. So, but Dr. Shelley, Andrea, Almeida, Alejandra, thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your expertise. I want to note for folks that a recording of the webinar will be available soon, and want to give one shout out to my team at Zeta. They put together a lot of information about how to reduce air pollution, and we'll be hosting the webinar as well on our website, zeta2030.org. So thank you again to everybody in attendance, and particularly to our wonderful panelists. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and this does conclude today's program. You may disconnect at any time.